On that bright afternoon, the Los Angeles International Airport buzzed with the usual hum of summer travelers. The air was filled with the mingled scents of coffee from the terminal cafe, the faint tang of jet fuel drifting in from the tarmac, and the low murmur of hundreds of conversations blending into one constant background song. Emily Harper, a small but sharp-edged 12-year-old, clutched her boarding pass in one hand and a worn paperback in the other. Her father, Captain Robert Harper, once a decorated Air Force pilot, walked beside her, his hand resting protectively on her shoulder. It wasn't often they traveled together. Robert's years of service had taken him to every corner of the globe, and Emily had grown up with stories of dogfights, emergency landings, and the incredible beauty of flying above the clouds. Today, though, was supposed to be ordinary, a simple flight to New York to visit Emily's grandmother. Neither of them had the faintest idea that in just a few hours, their journey would change the course of their lives forever. Inside the cabin, the air was cooler and faintly perfumed with that unmistakable airplane smell, a mix of new upholstery, recycled air, and a hint of disinfectant. The flight attendants greeted passengers with trained, welcoming smiles, guiding each one to their seat. Emily slid into 1-4A, the window seat, with her father taking 1-4B beside her. She placed her book in the seat pocket, but her gaze lingered on the sleek wing outside, stretching confidently into the sunlight. Ever since she was little, she had been fascinated by those wings, by the way they sliced through the sky as though the laws of nature bent willingly to the will of a pilot. Her father had nurtured that fascination, teaching her how to read cockpit instruments, explaining how flaps controlled lift, and even letting her fly in his old simulator in the garage. She had absorbed it all like a sponge, the way some kids memorize baseball stats or every lyric of a pop song. Emily's mind wandered as passengers filed in, a young couple with matching travel backpacks, an elderly woman in a wide-brimmed hat, a man in a suit already glued to his phone. She noticed things most people didn't: the captain's confident stride as he entered the cockpit, the quiet coordination between the flight attendants, the way ground crew vehicles moved like clockwork outside. Her father had taught her that flying wasn't just about skill, it was about awareness, being able to read every detail around you. Emily didn't know it yet, but this quiet observation would soon become her greatest asset. She buckled her seatbelt, ran her fingers along the armrest, and smiled faintly as the engines began their distant hum, a sound she'd always thought of as the heartbeat of the plane. This was supposed to be a routine flight, but somewhere in the vast sky ahead, the routine was waiting to shatter. The sun hung high above the clouds, casting long shadows over the endless plains of Kansas far below. Inside the cabin, the air was calm, punctuated by the occasional clink of ice in plastic cups, and the soft shuffle of passengers adjusting in their seats. Emily Harper was halfway through her book when the intercom crackled to life. The captain's warm, steady voice began describing the weather ahead: clear skies, a slight tailwind when, suddenly, it broke off mid-sentence. There was a faint click, then silence. At first, no one thought much of it. Intercom interruptions were common enough, but Emily noticed a change in atmosphere. The easy rhythm of service stopped. A flight attendant near the front froze for a fraction of a second before she turned and hurried toward the cockpit, her footsteps sharper than before. Emily's father glanced toward the front of the plane, his brow furrowing. "That's not good," he muttered under his breath. A few rows ahead, a man in a business suit shifted uncomfortably, craning his neck to see a flight attendant who had gone forward, reappeared moments later, her face pale, her eyes wide with something Emily had only ever seen in emergencies. Without a word, she motioned to another crew member, and they both disappeared into the cockpit again. Whispers began to ripple through the cabin. A baby cried somewhere, toward the back. Emily's chest tightened. Her father's hand went to the armrest, fingers drumming lightly, a gesture she recognized as him processing a situation he didn't yet want to explain. Then came the sound and alarm from the cockpit. It wasn't loud enough to pierce the cabin walls completely, but it carried the cold, mechanical edge of urgency. The flight attendants reappeared. One knelt by the intercom phone and spoke rapidly, her voice tight, professional but urgent. The other moved quickly up the aisle, leaning into select passengers and speaking in hushed tones. The whispers around Emily sharpened into fragments of conversation. "Something's wrong. The pilots, God help us." Her father leaned in close, his voice a low murmur. Stay calm. Just watch. Don't do anything unless I tell you." His eyes were locked on the front of the plane now, every muscle in his body alert. The announcement came not from the captain, but from a trembling flight attendant over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing an in-flight emergency. Both of our pilots have become unwell and are unable to continue operating the aircraft. We are in contact with air traffic control and are doing everything possible to ensure your safety. Please remain seated and keep your seatbelts fastened." A stunned silence swept over the passengers, broken only by a few gasps. Emily's heart thudded in her ears. She couldn't believe what she'd just heard. Both pilots. That never happened, at least not in the stories her dad told. The idea of this massive plane flying without a steady hand at the controls was something she'd never even imagined. Outside, the horizon shifted slightly, just enough for Emily to feel the faint change in the plane's angle. Her father noticed it too. "She's drifting off heading," he whispered, his eyes flicking to the window as if the sky itself would tell him the truth. The engines maintained their steady roar, but Emily could sense the subtle instability in their flight path. It wasn't panic-inducing yet, but the wrong moves, or no moves at all, could turn this into disaster in minutes. Somewhere in the front, alarms continued to chirp in their unyielding, mechanical rhythm. Her father's jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he might get up and offer his help, but his years in the military had taught him restraint. He knew stepping forward too soon could complicate the crew's chain of command. The minutes that followed stretched unbearably long. One of the flight attendants emerged from the cockpit carrying a small oxygen canister and a first aid kit. Another hurried to row 2, where a woman in a paramedic's jacket was seated, clearly a passenger, and now drafted into service. She moved into the cockpit without hesitation. Emily could see snippets through the narrow opening in the door. The captain slumped in his seat, the co-pilot pale and sweating, a headset dangling from the console. Even at 12 years old, Emily knew enough about cockpit layouts to recognize the blinking caution lights on the flight displays. The plane wasn't yet in freefall, but it wasn't holding steady either. Whispers turned into quiet prayers. A man clutched his rosary. A teenager pulled out her phone, typing furiously as though she could text her way out of this reality. Emily's eyes darted from passenger to passenger, feeling the fear swirl through the cabin like a cold wind. But inside her, something different was stirring. It wasn't bravado, and it wasn't recklessness. It was a strange, steady clarity. Every lesson her father had taught her about aircraft systems came flooding back in flashes. The way altitude was maintained, how autopilot could hold a course but not react to emergencies, how air traffic control could talk a pilot through procedures if they kept calm. Her hands twitched slightly in her lap, as though itching for the controls she'd only ever touched in their garage simulator. Suddenly, the plane banked a little harder to the left. It wasn't violent, but it was noticeable. Gasps rippled through the cabin again. One of the attendants grabbed the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain calm. We are in the process of establishing alternative piloting assistance. We are in full contact with the nearest air traffic control center." Emily caught the flicker of doubt in her voice. Alternative piloting assistance was not a phrase you wanted to hear at 35,000 feet. Her father exhaled slowly. His eyes locked on hers now. He didn't speak, but the look he gave her was one she'd only seen twice before, once when he'd taught her emergency landings in the simulator, and once when a car had swerved into their lane on the highway. It was the look of a man quietly calculating the odds and realizing that the margin for error was shrinking fast. The alarms from the cockpit grew louder, bleeding into the cabin even through the partially closed door. Emily could now hear snippets of the conversation with air traffic control over the open words like altitude deviation, manual input, and critical response window. The reality began to set in for everyone on board. Without someone at the controls, this aircraft carrying over 200 souls was a helpless, speeding mass of metal, entirely at the mercy of time, gravity, and chance. Emily's hands clenched into fists, her knuckles whitening. She didn't know what the next hour would bring, but she knew one thing: if the call for help came, she was ready to answer it. The silence after the last announcement was suffocating. People sat rigid, their eyes darting to one another, waiting for anyone to act. The steady hum of the engines seemed louder now, a constant reminder of the miles rushing beneath them with no one truly in control. Emily felt her heartbeat in her ears, but her mind was strangely calm. She had heard that voice in her head before, the one that told her exactly what to do when her father would throw simulated emergencies at her in the garage. Before she even realized it, she was unbuckling her seatbelt. Her father's hand caught her arm, his eyes searching hers for hesitation. There was none. She stepped into the aisle and, in a voice louder than she'd intended, said, "I know how to fly." A few heads turned, more out of shock than belief. Somewhere toward the front, a nervous laugh escaped someone's lips, as if she had just told a joke in the worst possible moment. A flight attendant glanced at her, her face twisted with disbelief. "Sweetheart, please sit down," she said quickly, her professional tone cracking under pressure. But Emily didn't move. "I'm serious," she said, locking eyes with the woman. "My dad's a pilot. I've trained on a simulator since I was 7. I know how to keep us steady until you land." Her words hung in the air, met with a chorus of murmurs. In another situation, it might have sounded absurd, this tiny girl in jeans and sneakers claiming she could fly a commercial airliner. But then the plane lurched, pitching slightly forward. A collective gasp erupted from the passengers. Drinks slid across tray tables. Overhead bins rattled. Emily grabbed the seat back in front of her, her knuckles tightening, but her eyes never wavered from the cockpit door. The moment passed, but the message was clear. They were running out of time. Her father rose beside her now, his voice deep and steady. "She's telling the truth," he said, looking directly at the crew. Trained her myself. She understands navigation, basic controls, and how to follow instructions from ATC. If you don't get someone in that seat now, you may not have another chance. The attendants hesitated, torn between protocol and desperation. A second jolt shook the plane. This one's sharper. Several passengers cried out. One of the attendants disappeared into the cockpit for a moment, then returned, her face pale. She leaned close to Emily. If you can do what you say, come with me. The aisle felt impossibly long as Emily walked toward the front, the eye of 200 strangers fixed on her. Some stared in disbelief, others in silent hope. She passed a man clutching his wedding ring, a mother whispering into her toddler's hair, a teenager gripping his phone like a lifeline. Each face burned into her memory, a reminder of what was at stake. When she reached the cockpit door, the attendant keyed in the security code. The door swung open, revealing a space both familiar and alien to her, similar to her father's simulator, but alive with flashing lights, warning chimes, and the faint hiss of radio chatter. The co was slumped in his seat, a medical mask over his face, an oxygen canister at his side. The captain was conscious but barely able to lift his head, his skin ashen. You're the volunteer, he croaked. Emily swallowed hard. Yes, sir, she replied. Just tell me what to do. With a faint nod, he gestured toward the left seat, the captain's seat. Emily slid in, her small frame dwarfed by the console, but her hands found the controls instinctively. The yoke felt heavier than in the simulator, alive with the subtle tremors of the aircraft's movement. A flight attendant slipped a headset over her ears, and the voice of Denver Center came through, firm and calm. Cockpit, this is Denver. Center, who am I speaking to? Emily pressed the mic switch. My name's Emily Harper. I'm 12 years old. My dad's a retired Air Force pilot. I've trained on a flight simulator for 5 years. I can follow instructions. There was a pause on the line, long enough for her to imagine the disbelief on the other end, but when the voice returned, it carried no trace of mockery. All right, Emily, we're going to work together. First, check your altitude and heading. Her fingers danced across the instrument panel. Altitude, 33,000 feet. Heading, 095. The controller's voice was steady. Good, we're going to level you out and bring you to a safe descent. Keep your eyes on the horizon indicator and ease the yoke forward just a hair. Good, hold it there. Emily obeyed, her movements precise. The turbulence outside was real, but she remembered her father's lessons. Don't fight the sky, work with it. Every shift in the wind was a conversation, not a battle. The cabin behind her was silent now, all attention focused on the invisible drama unfolding in the cockpit. Her father stood just behind her, one hand braced on the doorframe, his voice, low, but sure. You've got this, Em, just like we practiced. She nodded slightly, eyes fixed on the gauges. The controller's instructions came in a steady rhythm. Adjust pitch, check airspeed, correct heading. With each step, Emily felt the panic drain from her mind, replaced by an almost eerie focus. The most surreal moment came when she glanced out the windshield. The endless sky stretched before her, a rolling sea of white clouds beneath, the faint curve of the earth visible on the horizon. She wasn't just in a simulator anymore, this was real, and every motion of her hands sent a ripple through 200 lives. Her pulse raced, but her grip stayed steady. Denver Center, she said into the mic. The aircraft is stable. There was a beat of silence, then a warm, encouraging reply. You're doing great, Emily. Let's get you ready for descent. The voice of Denver Center came calm and firm through the headset, every word threading into Emily's mind like an anchor in the storm. All right, Emily, we've coordinated with Wichita Mid-Continent Airport for an emergency landing. You're about 14 minutes out. Keep your current heading. Begin gradual descent to 25,000 feet. Her small fingers gripped the yoke, and she eased it forward just as her father had taught her. Smooth, deliberate, no sudden movements. The nose dipped gently, the horizon rising in the windshield. She could feel the weight of the aircraft pressing differently now, the air growing denser as they dropped altitude. Asterisk behind her. The cabin was eerily quiet. 198 people sat holding their breath, every creak of the fuselage magnified in their minds. Some prayed softly, some clutched armrests until their knuckles whitened, and yet, there was a strange, unspoken trust forming because the girl in the captain's seat didn't look scared. Focused, yes, determined, absolutely, but not scared. Her father's calm presence behind her helped. His voice, low and steady, reminded her of long Saturday afternoons in the garage, running the simulator for hours until muscle memory took over. Asterisk, Emily. Reduce throttle to 75%, came the next instruction. Her hand reached for the thrust levers, moving them exactly to where she remembered from her practice sessions. The engine's deep hum softened, and the descent became more controlled. Good job, Emily. You're flying like a pro, Denver Center said, and though their tone was professional, she could hear the hint of disbelief behind it. Asterisk, the first glimpse of Wichita came into view, a sprawling patchwork of green and brown, Fields, dotted with silver grain silos and thin winding roads. In the distance, the faint shimmer of the runway reflected the late afternoon sun. It looked impossibly narrow from up here, a mere thread of asphalt on an endless quilt of land. Emily swallowed, her palms damp against the yoke. This was no longer just about holding the plane steady, this was about bringing it down without disaster. Emily. Start flaps to 10 degrees. The voice instructed. She reached for the flap lever, her eyes flicking between the instrument panel and the windshield. The plane responded, its speed bleeding off slightly. Now, gear down. The hydraulic thud echoed under her feet, and the green lights on the panel confirmed the landing gear was locked. The runway was growing larger now, details sharpening the white stripes. The numbers painted at the threshold. The emergency vehicles already lined along the sides like silent sentinels. As the minutes slipped by. Turbulence began to buffet the aircraft. Kansas crosswinds, her father had warned, could be unpredictable. The plane shuddered, nudging left, then right. A wave of nervous murmurs rose from the cabin, but Emily stayed steady, adjusting the yoke and rudder pedals with quick, precise corrections. Hold it. Good correction, Emily. Denver Center guided. You're almost there. Power back to 60%. Now 50. Keep her lined up. The descent became a blur of rapid-fire instructions. Just pitch, correct heading, monitor. Airspeed. Emily responded to each one without hesitation, her father's quiet affirmations behind her reinforcing every choice. The runway loomed closer and closer until it seemed to fill the entire windshield. The plane's shadow swept over the grass just beyond the tarmac, growing darker, sharper. All right, Emily. The controller's voice came with a note of gravity. Ease her down. Flare now. She pulled back gently on the yoke, just enough to raise the nose. For a heartbeat, time seemed to stretch. The main wheels met the runway with a thump, not the smooth kiss of a veteran captain, but not a crash either. A shudder ran through the fuselage as the nose gear touched down. Emily's hand went to the reverse thrust levers, pulling them back. The roar of the engines reversing, echoing like thunder in the cabin. The plane slowed, the vibration easing, and then stillness. A cheer erupted from the cabin, raw and unrestrained. Strangers hugged each other. Some cried openly. The intercom clicked on, and a flight attendant's voice, thick with emotion, announced, "Ladies and gentlemen, we are on the ground." Outside, emergency vehicles swarmed, flashing red and white lights reflecting off the windows. Fire trucks, ambulances, and airport police formed a protective wall around the plane as it rolled to a stop. Emily sat frozen for a moment, her hands still on the yoke, her breathing slow and measured. Her father's hand rested on her shoulder, warm and steady. "You did it, kid," he said softly. She allowed herself a small smile, though her mind was still replaying every second of the landing. She unclipped the headset, the cockpit suddenly feeling quieter without the constant stream of instructions. The cockpit door opened, and one of the attendants leaned in, tears glistening in her eyes. "Emily, you just saved 200 lives." The words felt unreal, as if they belonged in a movie and not in her own story. Passengers began peeking toward the front, some standing in the aisle to see the small figure who had flown them to safety. Phones were already out, recording, snapping pictures, streaming the moment to the outside world. When Emily finally stepped into the aisle, the applause rose again, louder this time, filling the cabin. People reached out to pat her shoulder, to thank her. The elderly woman in the wide-brimmed hat from earlier gripped Emily's hand and whispered, "God sent you to us." The businessman in the suit shook her father's hand, his voice thick as he said, "Sir, your daughter, she's a miracle." Outside on the tarmac, reporters were already gathering behind airport barriers, their cameras trained on the emergency stairway. As Emily descended, the late afternoon sun bathed her in golden light. The roar of applause from passengers mixing with the blare of sirens. Paramedics rushed past her to the cockpit to tend to the pilots. But for now, all eyes were on the 12-year-old who had done the impossible. It would take only hours for the story to hit national headlines. America's youngest hero, pilot, lands passenger jet. Interviews, talk show invites, news vans outside her home. Emily's name would be known far beyond Wichita. But in that moment, standing beside her father on the runway, she felt no need for fame. She wasn't thinking about cameras or headlines. She was thinking about every lesson her dad had given her, every hour spent in that garage simulator, and how all of it had led to this. When a reporter shouted, "Emily, how do you feel after saving so many lives?" She smiled faintly, her voice quiet but sure. Dad would be proud. And with that, she turned and walked with him toward the terminal, leaving the flashing lights and roaring engines behind, ready to step into whatever came next, because she had already proven, to herself and to the world, that she could fly.